Our fabrics have been cut. Our printed batting has been attached to our lining fabric. And now we get to start sewing our pieces by number. You'll begin by taking piece 1, and it's going to go in the section marked 1. You're going to place that within the blue lines, as the blue lines are your placement lines, not your stitching lines. Then we're going to take piece 2, and we are going to place it right sides together with piece 1. Again, the blue lines are your placement lines. So because these are relatively big pieces, we are going to put a couple of pins in here just to hold our fabrics in place. And you don't want to pin real deep into the project. You want to just kind of pin it into the top layers of the batting so that you don't get any puckers on the back side. Now we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance between these lines marked 1 and 2. When you set up your sewing machine to do a sew by number project, you need to make sure that you're going to be sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Some machines have a 1/4 inch presser foot, but those may not even be totally accurate. So you want to take a ruler and lower your needle and check on the ruler markings to see where your 1/4 inch is from your needle to your presser foot. For my machine here, this spot right where the plastic meets the metal is a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use that dimension when I'm sewing my seams. We're going to start sewing pieces 1 and 2 together. Because this is a really relatively large project, you can simply roll your batting and lining fabric so that it easily goes through your sewing machine. Now I'm going to make sure I'm using that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance while I'm sewing. And when you start, you want to back tack. This will make sure that all your pieces will remain in place. So we're going to sew pieces 1 and 2 together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We've sewn piece 1 to piece 2. We can remove our pins, trim away our strings, and then you're going to flip this open and finger press the seams between pieces 1 and 2. This is where the starch is so helpful to make sure that you get some nice, clean, crisp seams as you're working your project. We're going to sew pin piece 2 in place just to hold it while we move on to sewing on piece 3. So for piece 3, we're going to take our fabric and put it right sides together with piece 1. And again, we're going to make sure that it's on the blue line because the blue line is our placement line. And then we'll pin this piece and take it to the machine and stitch that. Again, this is a relatively big piece, so we can just roll this up, slide it under our machine, and again, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking, we can sew pieces 1 and 3 together. We've now sewn piece 3 to piece 1. We can take out our pins, clip our strings, keep that nice and tidy, and then finger press that seam open so it stays nice and flat. We'll put a couple pins in here to hold it in place for when we sew on our next piece. And I'm going to show you the back side and see how we're stitching all the way through the layers, the lining fabric, the batting, and our front, so that all the layers are secure just by simply sewing these top pieces. Now we're going to take and put piece 4 in place. And I've stacked my fabrics up by number so that I can access them quickly. So I'm going to take my piece 4, place it wrong sides together with piece 2. The number is 4, our 2's underneath, and then we're going to pin that and sew it in place. We've now stitched piece 4 to piece 2. Again, move our pins, finger press our seam, and then we can pin that down. I'm going to continue sewing my pieces by number all the way out to these far corners. This way, always lining up our fabrics on the blue lines, as these are placement lines, not our stitching lines. And we'll continue piecing and sewing. We've now completed sewing pieces 1 through 19. So this center section is all sewn up, and as you can see on the back, everything is neatly quilted up through the layers of lining, SewByNumber batting, and your top pieces. Now we're going to add the 2 corners. And the nice thing about the SewByNumber products is that as long as you line your pieces up on the blue lines, everything will come out straight. So even though you see that this is a little raggedy and perhaps you didn't quite make it to that blue line right there, if you put your next piece on that blue line, you're going to have a nice straight seam. So you want to go back, make sure all of these are nice and straight and even. You don't have to worry about trimming anything. Just line that on that blue line and pin these pieces in place. Pieces 20 and 26 are now sewn in place. And we're going to take the pins out like we've been doing. Finger press the seam. And now you can see how nice and even that whole line is. By lining everything up on these blue lines, we can make sure to continue keeping everything lined up as we sew, even if things aren't quite so perfect. So we're going to pin these down, add our next piece, 21 and 27, and I'm going to go ahead and complete these 2 corners. I finished sewing the last 2 pieces of my SewByNumber tote, the last 2 corners. I'm going to fold those over and finger press them and pin them in place. Now the entire top or outside of our tote has now been pieced together. The next thing we want to do is to trim this down to size. So we'll flip it over to the back side And this is where we're going to use that very first stitching that we did around the outside edge. So we're going to take a ruler and rotary cutter, or you can use the scissors, and we're going to trim just to the outside edge of that line that we've sewn. I'm going to use the rotary cutter so I can make sure that all my edges are nice and straight. So like I said, you want to cut all the way around the four sides, just to the outside of that line. Now that our tote is trimmed down to size, including the little notches at the bottom here, we can take this, perhaps press the top if you would like, and then we're going to stitch just to the inside, 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch around the entire perimeter of this front. This will keep all these layers in place while we construct the tote. I've secured all the layers of my tote bag using a straight stitch around the perimeter. If you'd like, you could also use a serger or zigzag stitch. The choice is yours. Now our entire SewByNumber tote base is complete, and we can move on to construction.